Welcome everyone tonight to our Ergonaut Mission Control Anatomy of Injury series. Tonight we're going to be going over lower extremities presented by Mr. Matt Gooch. And starting off with the rules of engagement for tonight from our panelists, they'll have a chance to ask questions, and some attendees might be able to ask questions. Everyone feel free to put any questions in the chat, and we'll get to them in a timely manner. Again, just try to be respectful of everybody's time and of each other's questions. And again, for introductions, we have a great panelist today and a great presenter, which Steve will go a little bit more in depth into that. And we are excited for tonight's presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us. And again, for tonight's attendees, thank you. And for any future listeners, thank you as well. And Steve, I'll let you introduce the panelist.
Okay, yeah, thanks, sir. I want to say we're honored to have Matt Gooch tonight. The reason this kind of came together is I got introduced to Superfeet at a trade show 20 plus years ago. Put a pair of my shoes. They literally changed my life. I spend most of my time on my feet presenting and doing whatever. And so I've stayed in contact with them. They're a friend of Ergonauts. We asked them to do this. So it was, Matt was, nice enough to put this together and give us time. And so we're super grateful. I'm not sure if Mike has got on yet. We got one of our he's actually an ergonaut. His name's Dr. Mike Gladden. He's a certified professional ergonomist. He also has a certification in ergonomics management. He's a great ergonomist, and he's a great business partner as well. We're honored to have Albert Moore. Albert's a friend. There's a joke that frequently when you're with Albert, you know that you're talking to the most brilliant person in the room. He's a great guy, and he's helping us push some initiatives forward that need some attention from a national perspective. So Albert, thank you for showing up. Same with we have got Dr. Greg Pitts. Greg is probably the #1 upper extremity therapist on the planet. He speaks frequently all over the planet, and he's consults on some of the toughest things going on. We also have Dr. Steve Stockhausen, and Steve's he's a member of Ergonauts. He's our chief operating officer. He's a physical therapist, goes doctorate in physical therapy, sports medicine, and so we appreciate you showing up, Steve, and we appreciate your expertise wanting to share. And then we have our CEO who showed up, and we always like to get Nichol up here because she brings a different point of view. And Nichol, thank you very much for giving up your time this evening and investing in our future. So I think that's all we have. Wait, no, actually we have our mission controller is mild-mannered and humble Rey Lira, and Rey is a pilot in the United States Air Force. He's a brilliant guy. We've asked him to be part of our advanced education committee, and he's our mission controller and puts these together and runs them for us. So anyway, thank you, Rey. Thank all of you all, by the way.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Steve. And before we hand it over to Mr. Matt Gooch, I just wanted to reiterate that Ergonauts does not have any financial conflicts with Superfeet Worldwide. The information presented is made available purely for educational purposes in the pursuit of the best practices and prevention of human suffering. So again, once again, we'll give the floor to Mr. Matt Gooch, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, I'm excited to be here. I've really enjoyed working with Steve since we've been able to connect over the last period of time here, and really excited also to get the perspectives throughout the course of this presentation of this panel. Just a unbelievably well experienced and knowledgeable panel across obviously a wide ranging kind of variable topic list. And so I think together we'll be able to put together a really good and hopefully useful resource for everybody that's watching live and everybody that might watch this after the fact. So with that, you just heard Ray throw out a disclosure. I will also do my own here in terms of the disclosures that I have. I'm currently the Vice President of Product and Innovation at Superfeet. We have kind of a variety of business partnerships that I'll throw out there as well that you can see on the screen. And so ultimately my goal here is really not to talk about Superfeet, but to really talk about an incredibly large problem. And you heard Steve mention it earlier. You'll hear it throughout the course of this presentation, is that lower extremity injury and really as a background contributing factor to a whole host of issues that manifest themselves in a variety of different ways, some very directly, but really most indirectly. And so tonight, hopefully we'll be able to talk through some of those things and provide some value. And if nothing else, just elevate the discourse around the importance of lower extremity health to the worker, because so many of these workers are constantly in pain and discomfort, whether it actually gets turned into a claim that gets them treatment or not. They are just in pain and discomfort. And so everything that we can do to help them be more comfortable and confident on their feet is something that we really want to invest in. And that's part of the reason why I'm here today. So for a lot of my presentations, I like to start with this quote. I'm going to try really hard to keep everything as simple as I can to make it as widely applicable to as many people as we can. That being said, there is some technical stuff that we'll have to get into. Certainly the panelists can contribute at that level and much higher. And so ultimately, we'll try to keep it as simple as we can to make sure that it can be as digestible and transferable as possible. But there is going to be some technical stuff, some anatomical terms. And so as we go through this process, if anybody has questions, wants clarification, any of those things, just drop that in the chat. Ray's going to be monitoring all those questions, and we'll be happy to provide any clarifications as needed. And so ultimately, I really want to start here because I think this sets up the conversation from the very beginning. And so if you don't clearly understand the potential connection between why I'll be talking about ice cream and sharks and lower extremity injuries, really what we're talking about here is this combination of ideas of correlation and causation. This is a kind of a well-read example of just because something is correlated with something else doesn't mean that that is directly related from a causation standpoint. Both the combination of things like polio rates in ice cream, as well as ice cream and shark attacks, they both happen to just spike when the weather gets warmer during the summertime, because more people are eating ice cream, more people are in the water, and the sharks are moving through. And then the same thing with the polio rates. And so ultimately, when we talk about what is actually the genesis and the causation behind so many of these lower extremity issues and injuries that we see, one of the most common misconceptions is that motion is the culprit. And ultimately, motion is just not. It is not. Motion does not hurt. What hurts is excessive tensile and compressive forces on the bone and other soft tissue structures. And the reason that excessive has that asterisk on it is because what's excessive for you and me or anybody else on this call could be highly variable. And that's one of the things that makes this conversation so incredibly difficult, and maybe one of the reasons why it doesn't get talked about nearly as frequently as other areas of the body when it comes to work-related issues. And so it is one of those things where people experience it so differently. And to make things even more difficult, particularly when we're talking about the lower extremity, is that people, or just we as a society, so often normalize foot pain and discomfort. As an example, really, if any other part of your body was consistently uncomfortable and hurting on a daily or weekly basis, it would stick out to you and you go, man, maybe I should go get that treated or get it checked out or seek some sort of counsel as to why this is the case. But it is just so normalized that it's almost an expectation. And as we get into the conversation today, I think we'll really be able to unpack some of that a little bit, but really get to what that might lead to. So kind of the end result of the compensation that people have, both kind of purposefully as well as just subconsciously when their feet are uncomfortable, or really their low extremity as a whole is uncomfortable. And so ultimately, like I said, we're going to start here. It's not motion that hurts. What it is the individual forces that are acting on individual and specific tissues, because ultimately it's force that drives that motion, and they can also stop that motion or start that motion again. And the size, direction, and timing of that force is really what determines the influence that it has. And so the thing about this is that it's going to vary person to person, circumstance to circumstance. And ultimately, one of the big takeaways that I want everybody to have is that only you move the way that you move. You have a unique configuration of bones, muscles, ligaments, and tendons that all come together to then create a unique loading pattern that is uniquely yours. And in fact, that movement pattern is so unique that now with the technology that's in place with markerless motion capture and AI generative learning, you can teach a computer systems to identify an individual person based on nothing else about them other than the way that they walk. You could have them walk through a crowded room and the computer could identify that as a specific individual simply because of the uniqueness of that gait pattern. And that's true about everybody and how they operate. And ultimately, one of the explanations for that in the literature is a theory called the preferred movement pathway, which basically says, hey, your body fits together in a specific way that's based on your unique anatomy. And in essence, what that delivers is more or less a path of least resistance. So your body's always trying to work toward that continual path of least resistance. And if you provide products and if you provide interventions that help facilitate the body more easily moving within that preferred movement pathway, in essence, it costs you less to do those things. And if you counteract that in some way, then your body will work harder to try and get back or maintain that preferred movement pathway. And so how does that translate to an injury conversation? So first, let's just start as a level set. Again, several of the members of the panel have an immense amount of knowledge when it comes to injuries in the workplace. But I know some people that may be logging in may not have as much of a frame of reference for what that looks like statistically. And so that's kind of where we want to start. So ultimately, when we're talking about injuries in the workplace, we have seen a very positive trend over the last 30 years of time when we look at a significant decrease in the total number of injuries that are occurring. One of the interesting things about that, though, is that the contribution of musculoskeletal injuries as a relative representation of that has been consistent. And so we haven't seen just a major drop off the cliff by any stretch of the imagination. And ultimately, what that kind of looks like is this graph that you see on the left side of the screen. And so the dotted line that you see running through the bar graphs, that's musculoskeletal injuries over time. So you can see going back from 92 to 2016, we can see that relative contribution to then missed days of work. And so when we see these major traumatic injuries to muscles, ligaments, tendons, leading all the way up to something that could be catastrophic, like an amputation, that's when you start to rack up, obviously, these massive days missed when we see this overall contribution. But really, we still see a large contribution to musculoskeletal injuries in the way that they then contribute to a potential worker or an entire pool of workers, in the way that they may either miss time from work because they're just unable to work. They either are being paid, or in some cases are not able to maintain their place in the workforce, or they may be at work, but may be significantly less efficient. And so all of those things are problematic, not only for the employee, but certainly for the employer as well. When we look in the private industry, going back to 2016, again, we can see where within these individual body segments we're seeing this contribution. And so ultimately, when we see the lower extremity contribution almost on the same plane as basically the low back or the back in general, there's no doubt that upper extremities are the largest contributing component, but still at a very similar type of contribution do we see lower extremities. But the overall conversation about lower extremity health, outside of maybe significant acute events that you might see within a given work environment, really pales in comparison to what people talk about, especially relative to back and upper extremities. And so when we look about, again, going a little bit deeper into the causes of those injuries, you can see kind of starting with overexertion and then kind of falling down in relative distribution there, both in terms of cost as well as the relative percentage of contribution of those injuries. And so when we look at it, kind of the previous slides were up to 2016, and now this is 2018 and beyond. You can kind of see what is consistent is overexertion involving outside sources is and has been number one and continues to be number one. But we also see other exertions and bodily reactions in that top 5 as well. So we're seeing consistent elements of not just a purely acute event necessarily, but sometimes these are just over time attributed to kind of that pain and discomfort over time that adds up, whether it is just with repetitive motion, whether it is that repetitive stress, or sometimes just the natural course of kind of breakdown of individual tissues. So when we look across industries, again, across all industries, overexertion is still going to be that highest. But then when we see individual individual industries, there is a little bit of variation across that top 5. But again, ultimately what we're talking about is a huge cost to employers, a huge cost to employees. And ultimately what we want to do is to be able to provide a pathway for these workers to be as safe as they can, to be as healthy as they can, and to be able to have as much success as they can in the workforce overall. And so the first thing I really want to throw out to the panel, like I said earlier, it's an awesome panel with a lot of varied perspectives, is if anybody has thoughts on why it is that from a lower extremity standpoint, both the factors that might contribute to other injuries outside of specific lower limb injuries, but then also just from a whole body perspective, why lower extremity injuries just get talked about, discussed, and focused on so much less than other anatomical regions of the body. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we'll open it up to the panelists now. Feel free to unmute yourself, panelist, and ask.
Well, I think one of the large contributors could be that the feet aren't instrumental to production directly. We're concerned about hand dexterity, shoulder movement, placement, and getting precision, whereas the feet are just kind of like get you there approximately to where you need to be and hold you there. And so people don't necessarily associate that body part to be even though it is a foundational factor for the supporting individual to get the work done, it's relatively ignored, I think, for that reason.
Definitely.
I was curious. I don't actually know the answer to this either, but I was curious if it possibly is because we're just constantly on our feet all day anyways, whether you're at work or elsewhere. And so that association of it being purely work related versus, just in your life, walking the dog, whatever it happens to be, it gets overlooked because you're always on them, 10,000 steps a day. Yeah, you might be getting 7,000 of those at work, but 3,000 elsewhere is still quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but over the last 20 years of kind of conducting surveys within this generalized workspace of well over 2,000 people that we've surveyed and worked with, they always rate like it is in the high 90s percentile of people that we've surveyed that they have some sort of clinically significant level of foot pain. It is so consistent across this very large worker pool, across a lot of demographics, a lot of different types of work sites. The consistent theme is if you're working on your feet, in all likelihood, it's not a very, let's say, amenable condition to feeling good about your feet at the end of the day. They're standing on hard, flat surfaces oftentimes, or in some cases, challenging underfoot scenarios. Let's say it's on a construction site or climbing up and down stairs or ladders or whatever it might be. it can just be really challenging to maintain kind of just general foot health. And then you have all the complications on top of that of the requirements of things like safety footwear, what does or doesn't fit well, and the variety of different combinations of factors. I think it's an interesting confluence of complication, I guess is the way that I would say it, because you have this scenario, and Albert, you just mentioned it, like, hey, all this focus is because they have to hold this thing to do this thing, or they have to be able to execute this task with something certainly other than their feet for the overwhelming majority of people. But also, so many of these people have to be on their feet in order to do all of those things in an effective way. And so it does seem to be kind of this accumulation of time and stress. And Steve, you just mentioned it. Hey, is it because people are just used to being uncomfortable or their feet hurting is just kind of an expectation? And that's certainly in line with a lot of the feedback that we've gotten over the last several years in and around that exact topic. It's just kind of an expectation. So even if the work that people are doing are contributing to that discomfort, very infrequently are they reporting that as something that would typically be very well associated with, oh, I need to be able to have the grip strength to execute this specific job task, and now I can't, and so I have to report that. They just don't report at the same rate, even for higher levels of intensity of pain and discomfort in the lower extremity, but certainly the feet specifically.
I believe there's less barriers for lower extremity injuries to go back to work than there are for upper extremity barriers to go back to work. And so they view the work activities as tool or dexterity or whatever. And so your feet deliver you there, but they don't put as many barriers on going back to work because they figure, well, there's not as much distraction or a problem to go back. And I think we all know that when you have foot pain or whatever, it's going to change a lot of mechanics, and it's going to become conscious in nature. It's going to impact dexterity. It's going to impact function of the upper extremity as well. But I don't think employers have those same barriers with lower extremities, upper extremities. It's just what I've seen.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and Matt, I'll tell you, my experience is that, people, this, like you said, people expect to have foot pain, and that's the thing. And when they're out of foot pain, it's like, oh, this is a good deal. And but from this perspective, from an ergonomics perspective, what we do, this is a perfect time because of, I know I'm not trying to steal your thunder, but an aging workforce is going to blow these things out of the water, and they're going to come out in a much more serious and significant way. So anyway, that's all I've got, but I'm already witnessing that, and, people in our industry. And so anyway, that's what I've got.
Yeah, I think that wave is coming for sure, Steve. I don't think there's any question about that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. I think when we look at the lower extremity as a whole, from my perspective, when we think about the workers and the broad cross-section of workers that certainly the panelists deal with, that we deal with, I think we're talking about all of these people are using their body as a tool in some form or fashion with the jobs that they're doing. And so when we think about, they have to be able to effectively execute using their body just like they would a specific piece of hardware to execute their job. And part of the really fundamental element of that is this idea of the majority of people are on their feet when they do their job. And so that primary contact point between them and the ground is going to be their feet. So in that scenario, the feet almost always serve as the foundation of the work that has to get done, because they're the foundation for the rest of the body. And so ultimately, some things that we need to remember relative to the feet themselves is, one, when you combine the bones in both the feet by themselves account for roughly a quarter of all of the bones in the entire body. So there's a lot of complexity to the foot and the way that it functions and responds to load in a variety of different circumstances. From the work that we've done, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'll re-emphasize it. From the work that we've done over the last 20 years or so, the majority of workers have some amount of registerable foot pain and discomfort And that usually cascades up. The two most common sites that we see, and we find that they're oftentimes very much linked. And potentially, if we have time at the end, we can talk a little bit more specifically around why that might be relative to kind of the correlation between foot function and lower back function in particular. But foot pain and lower back pain or discomfort are by far the two most consistently identified elements across all different work segments that we see. And not only in terms of people just responding that, yes, they have some amount of it, but the overall severity on a traditional kind of Likert scale is going to be highest of those two areas as well. So the intensity is higher, the persistence is higher. It tends to be around for longer and be more persistent overall. And so ultimately, when we're looking at the lower extremity, one of the interesting things about it being kind of this foundational element is it really starts to get hyper-focused on certain sections of the foot, because for the majority of people, we do have limited surface area that's in contact with, in essence, the shoe or boot that then is in contact with the ground. And that gets hyper-focused on two areas of bony prominence. One of those is going to be underneath the heel. The other is going to be the metatarsal heads in the forefoot. And so with that, depending on what the worker is being asked to do, whether they're walking, whether they're standing, if they're consistently moving, pushing, climbing up, climbing down, the load can vary very dramatically across how it expresses itself underneath the plantar surface of the foot, and then ultimately up through the rest of the body. And so we're going to focus just to be from a broad and generalization standpoint, we're going to focus kind of on standing and then walking. But obviously there's a lot of different applications, whether that is, again, climbing, whether it is specific movements where they are either carrying, unloading, loading. There's so many different varieties of the types of load that people might experience. But ultimately, again, for the sake of simplicity tonight, we're just going to be focusing on standing and walking. And so we'll start with standing, and you'll see the person on the left side of the screen has really just adopted a very common adaptation to standing for a long period of time that a lot of people do. So she's standing, the majority of her weight is shifted to her right side. We see her right hip is also higher as part of that. So we have a significant unloading where typically you would roughly say, hey, each foot's bearing about 50% of the weight. That's absolutely not the case in this scenario as she's standing there. And so the first thing that we're going to highlight just as an additional stress point is laterally on the knee, we're going to see a significant increase in compressive force on that lateral side. As that then translates down, we're going to see continual lateral tension, both across the IT band as well as just leading down to the lateral side of the foot. As we get into the foot, when that happens, we still have a traditional load sharing mechanism underneath the plantar surface of the foot, but it is bearing a significantly larger amount in relative comparison than it typically would if weight was equally balanced between the 2 feet. And so ultimately what that load sharing mechanism looks like is what you see here. So it's a combination of both the plantar ligaments overall, the plantar fascia, as well as the plantar intrinsics. And so those 3 layers of tissue working together to create structure underneath the foot that is able to respond to the load that's being placed on it. So whether that is pure just vertical loading force, if we have additional shear forces from the ground reaction force standpoint, either relative to shifting of weight and or just executions of general job movements. Even if somebody's standing, oftentimes they're moving and pivoting just during the course of their activities of their job. And so ultimately what we can then see is when you look at a slight layer above just the plantar surface, we then see significant tension on the Achilles, as well as that force kind of axial loading that's coming down through the tibia. As that happens, that is part of what creates that tension load bearing effect of the plantar ligaments. But what's not pictured on in this picture here, and if you can see my cursor, where you then see is increased compression forces at the top of these bones. So both where the navicular feeds into the first cuneiform, and then where the first metatarsal in particular comes back to the first cuneiform, This area in particular, whether it's standing and or walking, gets a lot of increased friction and wear and tear, especially the more mobile or lacking dorsiflexion stiffness that first metatarsal is, as it continues to flex up and down. That's one of the most common sites of like a dorsal exostosis. So it's just a bony prominence that develops, and that can be both uncomfortable as well as then lead to things like laces on a shoe that cross over that point and increase the likelihood that then you might get numbness or discomfort over time, especially as the feet swell and take up more room in the shoe over the course of a general workday. And so all of those things working together, again, even in the most low duty, less intense work environments, still creates an opportunity for a lot of stress and discomfort to be placed on a given foot for a given person over the course of a workday. When we talk about the foot in motion, what we're thinking about is kind of three key factors or roles that the foot is going to play and contribute to the overall gait cycle. So the first one is going to be adaptation. In the most broad and general sense, when our foot hits the ground, it's trying to adjust and adapt to whatever's underneath it. And ultimately, that's kind of what you see pictured on the screen. You can see the foot kind of wrapping around that round surface of the log that it's standing on. And ultimately, for the majority of people, what they're adapting to is the hard, flat surface of their boot or shoe, which is then on the hard, flat surface of the ground that they're standing and working on. And unfortunately for our feet, they have adjusted and adapted to really be a three-dimensional surface that's made to best operate on top of a three-dimensional surface. And when we get into a situation where things are incredibly hard and flat, it's extremely stressful for our feet because it creates two scenarios that add to that complication. One of those is going to be increased compressive forces on the plantar surface of the foot in those high contact areas that I mentioned earlier underneath the heel and then across the metatarsal heads, and then prolonged traction forces as our foot naturally elongates during the adaptation phase. When we stand, especially in staying in that prolonged phase of adaptation, that additional tension creates stress on a variety of different structures across the plantar surface of the foot, but primarily the plantar fascia, as it's the primary contact point between your heel and your forefoot. And so, you know, just like when you take a rubber band, you hold it in your hand and you pull those two hands apart, it creates more tension there. The same thing happens to the plantar fascia when you just stand for longer periods of time. We start to get that traction effect. And most frequently, people feel that at the insertion, or I'm sorry, at the origin of that plantar fascia, just on the front part of the heel bone of the calcaneus. So as we move out of that adaptation phase, we hit that ground, we start to move forward. We move into that more propulsive phase of gait when we're moving. When we do that, our foot goes through a process called supination. And so basically, supination and pronation are diametrically opposed in every direction. So whatever motion the foot moves in to pronate, it moves in the exact opposite direction to supinate. And so ultimately what that does is it takes us through a process that allows the foot to then become more of a rigid lever to pivot over our metatarsal heads to help us move forward efficiently and effectively. And then the third thing that oftentimes doesn't really get discussed, particularly in more, we'll call it like mechanical conversations, is proprioception. And so getting that proprioceptive feedback from our feet is incredibly important. Feet in general are one of the largest contributors to proprioception. We have a foot that is full of different types of mechanoreceptors. We have 4 different types, 2 different fast-acting, 2 different slow-acting mechanoreceptors, and they are widely distributed all over the plantar surface of the foot. And so we're constantly getting feedback throughout the course of the day, depending on what it is that we're doing, if we're walking, running, hopping, skipping, jumping, whatever it might be. But that proprioceptive feedback is incredibly important, just so that your brain basically knows where the rest of you is as a focal point. So between knowing where your feet are in space and knowing where the rest of your body is above that, it is incredibly important feedback. So when we're walking, it's most often described as a process of kind of an inverted pendulum. And so where typically you would think of a pendulum, you know, if you're holding a string and it's swinging back and forth, the fixed point is at the top. When we walk, it's inverted. Our fixed point is our foot against the ground. And so our center of mass starts lower, ends up getting highest when we are in the middle of that mid stance. And then as we transition into that propulsive phase of gait, it sinks back down. And so ultimately where we see really higher rates of stress during the gait cycle is going to be when we start to pivot into that propulsive phase of gait out of that mid stance phase. And ultimately when we start to see that heel lift. It becomes more stressful because now you have a significant amount of that body weight solely being applied to the smallest surface area available in that forefoot on smaller bones in relative comparison to, say, what we have during that heel contact phase. The biggest difference is, though, the relative position of our center of mass. During heel contact, what we're going to see is that center of mass is behind our heel. So we're not bearing the same type of weight across that bone. And it's a larger singular surface. So it's more really accustomed and able to effectively deal with those stresses. When we look at the forefoot, it's a series of still round bones on the metatarsal heads, but those metatarsal heads are significantly smaller. And obviously, when we look at the anatomy of the foot just coming up in a few slides, we'll get into some of those details a little bit more. But ultimately, you can see kind of represented the arrows that we see here. You can think about those as relative expressions of a theoretical magnitude and direction of those ground reaction force vectors. So we see as you're hitting that foot down on that contact phase during heel strike all the way through toe off, where the direction and the magnitude and relative comparison is overall. And that manifests itself here as well in terms of the visualization of the different segments of the foot and the way that they experience load during the gait cycle. So this is a plantar pressure measurement. So we're only looking at the vertical component of ground reaction force, which is roughly speaking about 95% of the total force experienced. We've got medial lateral shear and anterior posterior shear that we can't account for in plantar pressure, but we get a really good picture of the majority of load that's being experienced. And so you can see on the left-hand side, we've got the left and right foot. You can see the color-coded zones and then how that translates over to the right side of the screen, where we see how that's represented on the individual loading patterns of the specific areas of the foot. So we can see slight differences between left and right during this gait cycle. And then I've overlaid the gait cycle from the previous slide over that just so you can see a relative phasic look at what is happening at different parts of the gait cycle and the types of relative load that might be experienced by those sections of the foot during that phase. So with kind of all of that in mind, let's get into some of the specifics on actual anatomy. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I just want to make sure that we level set. One, when we think about bones, obviously they're providing structure, right? Because without our bones, we wouldn't be able to do a whole lot except kind of flop around as a big blob of soft tissue. Ultimately, when we think of ligaments and tendons, I think there's maybe an old adage that contributes to some misunderstanding where people say, hey, tendons are like ropes and ligaments are like rubber bands. And that's just not accurate with the way that the individual soft tissues operate. Ligaments are anchoring bone to bone and add stability in and around joints, depending on their location. Muscles are anchoring to bones via those tendons, and obviously they're the movers. When they connect and move across those joints, that's what allows us to move different segments of our body and be able to execute whatever tasks that we're asking our body to do. When we look at the overall kind of structure of the lower body, when we think of the pelvis, you can kind of think of it serving two different primary functions. One of those is being kind of an articulating bucket for our abdomen and upper body to sit in. So it kind of holds as a bucket, but it articulates. So in multiple planes of motion, both in and around the pelvis on both sides are able to have some different articulation and movement. The femur is the longest and strongest bone in our body. Ultimately, anytime in the body where we see really long bones, they are primarily going to be levers. And so certainly when we talk about the femur and the tibia, Both of those are primary movers and very strong levers that we need to function extremely well. The tibia, what everybody thinks of as their shin bone, shin bone connected to the thigh bone, all of those things that you learned in the songs that you learned as a child are incredibly true. And then the fibula is always interesting because it is a non-weight bearing bone in your lower leg. It's a fabulous clothes hanger for muscle attachments. Despite being non-weight bearing, it is a bone that is able to be broken from a weight bearing scenario. So the most frequent types of fractures that you see, for example, are either going to be from collisions, so something hitting that lateral side of your leg, or from a very strong force eversion. So you think of a slip and fall, or that type of scenario where you have a significant amount of eversion. In sports, particularly American football, you would hear like a high ankle sprain. And really serious high ankle sprains then contribute to things like a rupture of your syndesmosis, which is the series of connective tissue that kind of goes all around and keeps your ankle mortise in place. And then because the force is so immediate and strong, oftentimes that will lead to a fibular fracture. I know that personally because I've done it, and I can tell you, I don't recommend it. I don't recommend trying it in case it looked fun. Like if you're ever watching a football game and you see somebody do it, and you see them crying and limping off the field or being carted off, it's really not fun. I don't recommend it. But it is a injury that has a long recovery period as well because of the number of different structures that are involved. Anytime, obviously, that you do serious ligament damage, it's just harder to repair those without significant surgery. And then you have all the complication potential of surgery as well. So when we look at the foot, I mentioned earlier, the 2 feet together, 56 total bones. You get a quarter of the bones in the body and the feet. You'll oftentimes see the number of bones in the foot represented a couple different ways. One of those is people say, hey, there's 26 bones in the foot. I personally would vehemently disagree with that, but a lot of people say that. 26 plus 2 is the most frequent way that I personally refer to it in all of our training materials, or you just see people say 28 total. And ultimately, the reason that we add those extra 2 is because you have 2 sesamoid bones underneath your first metatarsal head that function exactly and just as importantly as your kneecap does for your knee. And so ultimately, we need those to function in order to facilitate dorsiflexion of your big toe, your hallux during the gait cycle. We really need those sesamoids in place. And I promise you can break them. Again, really wouldn't recommend it. I haven't done that, thankfully, because they don't have a lot of good blood flow. And as a result, they can be very difficult to heal. So you can break them. They're super important. And so we always count. So 28 bones it is. And so when we think about the individual anatomy of the foot, we're going to break that foot up into 3 different sections. First is going to be the rear foot. We're going to start in the back and go to the front. The big thing that I always ask people to remember around the foot, even if you don't remember names from an anatomical perspective, remember general shapes, because in particular, when you think of the foot, if you can remember relative shapes, you can remember how those individual areas of the foot are expected to function. So when we look at the rear foot, we're looking at 2 very large bones in relative comparison to the rest of the bones in the foot, in the talus and the calcaneus, and they have lots of large rounded surfaces on them. And so typically what that's going to mean is a little bit more free flowing movement. So both rotational movement, kind of sagittal plane facilitation of both rocker and the calcaneus, as well as that sagittal plane movement against a large joint surface in the talocrural joint, show your traditional ankle joint. And then as that talus then connects to your midfoot, you also then get that connection into the navicular. And so there's 2 large kind of flowing joint surfaces that we look at there. When we look at the midfoot, we transition from 2 really big, large bony surface areas to lots of smaller ones. And so when we think of those midfoot bones, we think of smaller, boxier bones that with the combination of structure, with the way that they anatomically fit together, as well as the ligamentous attachment around them, they can be kind of spread out that allows that foot to adjust and adapt to things underneath it. but they can also be kind of close packed together in a way that allows it to be very firm and rigid as we move through that propulsive phase of gait. And so smaller, more squared surfaces that can fit together in a very close packed way, or be a little bit more flexible, again, at different points in the gait cycle. And then finally, the forefoot, again, in relative comparison, we've got long bones. We need those to be levers. So ultimately leading to that transition of body weight as we pivot over the metatarsal heads during the gait cycle. And so you can see highlighted there, the sesamoids, as I mentioned, they sit just underneath the metatarsal head on the first MPJ there. And so that's why we just kind of brought them up to the surface so that you get a more clear visual of where they're often located. And so total, not only do we have 28 bones in the foot, 26 plus 2, but we also have 33 joints. So a lot of different surfaces that interact with each other and really deal with a lot of complex movement and the translation of a lot of different forces as we move through different parts of the gait cycle, or just when we're standing in a general sense. And so each section of the foot that we just reviewed, I'm going to highlight one specific joint that really contributes to a lot of the function in that portion of the foot. So for starters, we'll look at the subtalar joint in the rear foot. So the subtalar joint, kind of just like it sounds, sub, under, talar, talus. So it's right underneath the talus. It's where the talus and the calcaneus come together. You only had 2 bones, so it was really the only option of a joint that come together in that rear foot there. So we have the interaction between the talus and the calcaneus. This is super important in translating foot motion in a variety of different ways. Obviously, most of the time, what we're looking at is a harder flat surface. There's motion that is occurring in 3 different planes at all times when we're talking about foot motion. It is a triplanar motion in terms of pronation and supination. So as a result of that, we have complex movement in all of these different joints. And so when we look at that subtalar joint, oftentimes the stability of that joint, the literature shown, is highly dependent on the type of facet configuration that individual person has. What I mean by that is the way that the individual touch points between the calcaneus and the talus come together. That's very specific articular surface. The number of facets, the fewer the facets there are, the individual separate contact points, typically the more flexible that joint is going to be, the harder it is for that individual to control the motion of the foot just inherently within. And generally, according to the literature, is going to increase the risk of things like subtalar joint arthritis, as an example, just because there is so much more movement and stress within the relative amount of force that joint experiences. So when we move forward, that transition from the rear foot into the midfoot, we're really focusing on the mid-tarsal joint. And the reason that this is so important is because it's actually a combination of 2 different areas coming together, not only the rear foot into the midfoot, but the interaction between the talus and the navicular, but then also the calcaneus and the cuboid. So those 2 individual joint connections are incredibly important for being able to translate just general forces through the foot efficiently and effectively. And if we're not able to create inherent stability in the foot during the gait cycle as we're transitioning there, that's where, in particular, the combination of something like a foot orthosis or an insole can help translate that force more effectively in a way that is less either stressful for the foot or at least more efficient for the foot. But ultimately, we see also when we strip away soft tissue, typically the apex of the physical bony structure of that arch is going to be in and around the mid-tarsal joint. So when you look down at your foot, if you were to look at it right now with all the soft tissue on it, the visual height of the arch is going to be a kind of appearing to be further forward. And anatomically, it is often further back than most people realize. And then third is going to be the first metatarsal phalangeal joint. So your big toe joint, we really need that to function well in order to facilitate efficient movement moving forward. And it is probably one of the largest sources of contributing pain dysfunction to the rest of the foot. When people have functional or kind of functional restrictions or restrictions that over time accumulate into kind of a fixed restriction in that joint, it becomes harder and harder to not only walk efficiently and effectively in terms of a pure lever perspective, but also creates additional stress on more proximal structures. So a big contributing factor, if we don't have that flexibility in the big toe, it's very difficult for our feet to utilize the windlass mechanism efficiently. And what that really looks like is what we see visualized here. So we need that dorsiflexion to happen. If you can imagine, instead of the hand that's pushing up that big toe, instead of it just being like this, if you pivoted that foot relative to the ground, that's really what we need to happen during the gait cycle to self-create that inherent stability in the foot. When we dorsiflex that foot, not only do you see a raising of the arch that's depicted here, but we also get external rotation. So we get external rotation of the foot itself, as well as the lower limb, all the way up to the knee, just by getting that dorsiflexion involved during the gait cycle. And so finally, when we look at the foot, we also have 3 different arches that we want to make sure to highlight, because not only anatomically are they there, but they also affect a variety of different things in terms of the way that an individual foot is going to interact with a given piece of footwear or a given insole, or the combination of those 2 things. Typically, when people think of their arch, they just think about that medial longitudinal arch. If you ask somebody to point to their arch, 99.9% of the time, they're pointing to that medial longitudinal arch. And so it runs from the base of your heel to the base of your first metatarsal head, in essence. And that medial longitudinal arch spans the overwhelming majority of your foot. So when we think about that, there's a lot of things that happen there, but there's also other ones that we want to focus on. So that calcaneal cuboid arch, it's on the lateral side of the outside of the foot, is super important. It transitions again from that calcaneus into the cuboid, getting that joint articular surface to come together efficiently and effectively in the right timing during the gait cycle is, again, super important. It's part of that mid-tarsal joint connection that I just mentioned. And oftentimes is a little bit forgotten in terms of, if you look at a lot of the ways that either custom insoles or over-the-counter insoles, as an example, are created, oftentimes you'll see a void of lateral shape. And so that can be challenging in certain scenarios, especially for feet that have a more present or prominent calcaneal cuboid arch. And then the transverse arch is going to be that general kind of domed element underneath your metatarsal bones. So not underneath the metatarsal heads. That's a common misconception when we look at kind of a plantar grade loading of the foot. The metatarsal heads themselves are not domed. They're all in full contact with the ground. But the bones behind them have that domed element of the transverse arch. So again, if we're looking for opportunities to do things like offload the forefoot or create opportunities for reduced loading, we may try to fill that space to be able to do that more effectively and transfer that relative load onto, let's say, the metatarsal shaft as opposed to the metatarsal head itself. So I'll pause there just real quick to see if we had any questions or any comments that the panel wanted to add. Otherwise, we'll get into a little bit of footwear.
Yeah, definitely. We will give it a second to let the panelists unmute themselves if they want to ask something.
Actually, yeah, this I just wanted to touch base. One of the things we do, and we use the acronym FARE, F-A-R-E, but force, awkward posture, repetition, and environmental issues, which all of these things kind of go together. But I've heard Dr. Pitts talk time after time about one of the real biggies in everything we do is posture, and what we're just talking about as far as if your foot's not aligned right, that's, we're naturally creating an awkward posture already. And then we step into a ill-designed workplace, that's magnified. So that's kind of Greg's thunder. But he articulates that frequently, that postural issue. So force, awkward posture, repetition, every single risk factor is present in your lower body just for the mechanics of it.
Yeah, and I'll throw footwear into that as well. Oftentimes, one of the most common contributing factors that we see is worn out footwear. And so creating kind of an unnecessary additional stress in a variety of different ways for someone. So even if, let's say, their standard operating posture could be fine, you can have something that is significantly exacerbated by the presence of worn out footwear, because it's creating an artificial environment that's more stressful for the foot. And so obviously that has the potential to have a cascading effect up the kinetic chain in a variety of different ways as well. So we'll roll through this real fast. Hey, footwear's come a long way. Steve and I were talking, before we got started here, and he was like, "Hey, I'd love to have that old pair of Red Wings," and I was like, "Not if you were working in them on your feet, you wouldn't." But I think ultimately they're pretty, right? They look great, and several brands have their heritage collection, right? Where now they're more style boots that they look great in. Versus what we see on the other side of the screen there. This boot, as an example, has a BOA lacing system, has a composite safety toe, is puncture resistant, slip resistant, and safe for electrical hazard. There's a lot of technology built into that boot, on top of the fact that it then has a midsole that, for the overwhelming majority of people, they will find a lot more comfortable and able to be working functionally. Now, what are you sacrificing when you go to something like this, where it's a foam midsole as opposed to a leather midsole, or something that you might see, let's say, in that classic boot on the side? And ultimately, it's probably in the vein of durability, but functionality for that individual worker during the time at which they are in that boot is significantly elevated. So there's definitely pluses and minuses on both sides. And so when we're trying to look at, hey, what is the best things that we should be focusing on, what goes into finding the right piece of footwear in the work environment that's going to help the worker be safe, that's help the worker be healthy, and ultimately, like we like to say, is comfortable and confident on their feet. Because if they're both comfortable and confident, everything else becomes less of a distraction. They're able to focus on the tasks that they're being asked to do and do them as efficiently as possible. And the first place we're always going to start is, what are they required to wear? Because there's huge amounts of variation depending on the workplace, the individual risks. We saw at the very beginning of the presentation how much general issues have been reduced in terms of worker injury and safety since the early 90s. And having required footwear is one of the contributing factors to that. There's no doubt. And so while several of these features help to keep workers safe, several of those same features also contribute to different types of injuries. So we'll chalk that up to unintended consequences in a variety of different ways. As an example, when we start looking at safety footwear, even if we're just looking at safety toe footwear as an example, there is a sacrifice in how comfortable most of those boots are, because given the option, almost nobody would say, I'm just going to casually wear around a steel-toed boot because I like it, right? They just tend to not be nearly as comfortable as a non-safety toe footwear. But if you drop something really heavy on it, you'll be really glad it was there. But at the same time, what we also see in the literature is an increase in falls, in trips, and also general ratings of discomfort and foot pain increase anytime the safety toe footwear is present and required on a job site. So we have this balance. We're protecting one element of the foot because those injuries tend to be very costly. We saw earlier those catastrophic musculoskeletal injuries, a crush injury as an example, are catastrophic both to the worker as well as to the employer. But at the same time, it can contribute over time to other types of issues that either may be reported or may not. And so you've heard me talk about comfort several times. And so for a lot of people, they can say, well, why does comfort really matter? Do we really need to focus on comfort? It feels a little touchy-feely. Do we really care about people's feelings? And I would say, ultimately, when we talk about comfort, there's a lot of good research that shows comfort is something that we should focus on for a wide variety of different reasons, but it's always relative to the individual scenario in which we are assessing it. So the interesting thing about comfort is, despite being subjective and despite being a little bit touchy-feely, there's a lot of really solid biomechanics behind paying attention to comfort in particular. So one of those is that across multiple applications and multiple types of footwear and multiple use cases, comfort has been linked to injury. So the more comfortable you are in your footwear, the less likely you are to be injured. And this is incredibly important because ultimately, again, it is the interaction that we have with both footwear and environment that leads to a variety of different types of stressors that somebody might experience in the lower extremity. So comfort ratings are going to vary dramatically person to person. Adding things like insoles to the overall equation of both footwear and worker has been shown to increase perceived comfort for the majority of people. And in a lot of ways, this goes back to just pure anatomy. The role that the insole plays is being able to serve at a most fundamental level as an adapter. So it helps adapt that two-dimensional, in probably a best case scenario, two-dimensional piece of footwear to your three-dimensional foot. So the example that I like to use is for those of you that have ever traveled in Europe, you want to take your iPhone or a tablet or a computer and you want to plug it into the wall, you got to take your bag of adapters, because every single country that you go to, they all have different wattages, and you have to be able to have the right plug to plug into the wall so that you can not fry your iPhone. And so ultimately, the role of insoles and custom foot orthoses is basically the same. We want to be able to adapt that stressful surface of the boot more effectively to your three-dimensional foot and improve that overall interface as a whole. And so again, why comfort? It gives us a really good approximation for the larger kind of neuromotor response that our body is having to a given intervention, whether that is a footwear intervention, whether that is a combination of footwear and insoles together, whatever it might be. And so even if we don't know why we might like this one better than that one, that's okay. For the majority of people, especially those that are less experienced or less seasoned, either in those types of footwear or those job applications, the most important things to pay attention to are when people say this specifically does not feel comfortable. I don't like this. Those ratings tend to be the ones that are most significant and the most consistent over time. And so ultimately, we kind of have two layers to this. One of those is going to be this idea of, hey, when we use a more comfortable thing, we decrease that likelihood of injury. And over time, we refine that personal comfort filter. So the more experience that we get within a given either use case or activity or type of footwear, oftentimes we have a much better sense of what works well for us. And so as we refine that comfort filter, it becomes incredibly important to make sure that we're listening to it. Overall, though, there are those times where we may need to give guidance to somebody who is either totally new or we're just trying to give them the best case scenario, best chance of success. And so there's three things that we want to pay attention to maximize comfort in footwear. One of those is going to be we want to try to match the shape of the shoe to the shape of the foot as much as possible, knowing that oftentimes in a work environment, safety footwear in particular is going to be harder to do that, whether that's in lash shape or just ruggedness of material. A lot of times we don't have as many options. And when you look inside of a shoe and the foot relative to the shoe, we know if we can't accommodate shape of the foot with the shoe, the foot is going to accommodate the shape of that shoe. So over time, if you wear really narrow forefoot shoes, your forefoot is going to become more narrow and more angled as a result of that. Those are the stresses, the external stress and force that the shoe itself is applying to your foot, and you will see that adaptation over time, even if we don't want it. So shoe fit alone is not going to be sufficient for driving comfort. There's huge amounts of variation in the types of construction, the individual construction methods for boots, the individual upper constructions, the type of cushioning or potentially lack thereof. And so all of those things are going to come together and need to be considered, including even in some cases, the height of the collar, let's say, of a work boot and how that might interact with individual anatomy, particularly of the lower third of the tibia. Because those are the types of things, let's say if somebody has more curvature, tibial varum, a little bit more bow-legged, they're going to really get more lateral stress on the sides of those boots. And if it's a tight collar or a restrictive collar, it can create a lot of irritation on the bone and soft tissue. And then finally, specificity of movement. So how people use the footwear is incredibly important in terms of how they evaluate that footwear. And so ultimately, in a general sense, when you ask somebody to rate footwear from a comfort perspective, standing, we are going from sitting to standing, general or average comfort ratings will decrease. When you go from standing to walking, they will decrease. And when you go from walking to running, they will decrease further. So the more intense the activity becomes, the overall rating for comfort of any given piece of footwear on average will continue to decrease. And so ultimately, we want to make sure that people are evaluating the footwear as they're trying it on in as close to a realistic scenario for how they're going to use it as possible. And so real quickly, let's run through some of these lower extremity injuries. Ultimately, if we even take a zoomed out perspective from how the general population experiences just life as they go through, over 75% of the US population will have foot pain at some point in their life. That will be significant enough that they will seek out some either medical help or some type of intervention for that. And so fewer than 20% have ever utilized something like a custom device or an over-the-counter insole. And insoles and custom foot orthoses can significantly reduce the risk of a whole lot of different stressors that might lead to some of that foot pain and the need to seek treatment. When we look at specifically the work environment, we see that the severity of foot injuries can vary in large accordance with then the amount of settlement that would be associated with that type of injury itself. And so whether that goes from very, very minor all the way up to extremely severe, when you think of like an amputation or a full loss of use, there is a lot of variability, not only in the amount of money potentially, but also the lost time. And so this was a recent study out of 2022 that was looking at for those severe lower limb injuries. There's a whole host of cascading problems associated with those. Not only do we see, this was a study that was 857 people, so it's a pretty good size to this study. Not only do we see increased average cost at over $64,000 a patient, when we look at the factors behind those lost productivity, it's not just that they're not working. There are some people that are there, so presenteeism, they're there, but they're just not very efficient. And so that's part of that kind of a loss that we don't always see or account for in an effective way. Ultimately, again, when we have these catastrophic injuries, they are hugely impactful, both to the economy of the individual employee, as well as just their overall ability to perform job functions. And so let's take a look at some common risk factors for those lower extremity injuries. Obviously, in the majority of work surfaces, people tend to be more aware of slippery or uneven surfaces. So whether a slip-resistant sole is required or not, in those scenarios in which there is uneven surfaces, it's always going to increase the likelihood of trips and falls. And so anything that we can do to not only maintain the cleanliness of those areas, keeping them dry, reducing the likelihood of slipping, but also the presence of things like anti-slip footwear or slip-resistant footwear, as well as anti-slip mats. All of those things can contribute to a much more stable and consistent working surface, and ultimately the greater health of the individual. Proper footwear. So certainly if there are safety requirements for a given type of job, that's always paramount in terms of how do we give them the best chance of being successful and staying healthy. But ultimately, oftentimes the footwear itself is lacking, and that's where there's either opportunity to improve the overall fit and consideration of how that footwear is interacting with that specific foot, or potentially augmenting that and making it fit and function better for them with introducing something like an insole or a custom foot orthosis. So ultimately, when we look at the opportunity for improving fit, I think that's one of the lowest hanging fruits that we have available. We know that there's going to be some restriction and challenge with different types of requirements of different types of footwear, jobs, and activities. But finding a way to improve the overall fit and giving employees and workers a better chance of success from the beginning goes a very long way into reducing the likelihood of that pain and discomfort. Obviously, there's always a component of overuse and stress. You heard Steve mention it earlier. Anytime we have the combination of any of the above factors and then combine that with repetitive stress, the likelihood of a given tissue or multiple tissues breaking down, wearing down, goes up dramatically. And especially then when you combine that with either poor posture or body mechanics, all of those things together really start to kind of become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we're not able to reduce the repetitive stress by either alternating job function or really driving a more ergonomic workstation, we know that there's going to be a compounding interest to the stress that the body accumulates if we're not able to do those things. And so that always, hopefully, is a priority. That's why the great work that Ergonauts does to be able to provide those ergonomic assessments, to be able to drive those solutions, remove barriers for finding those solutions most effectively, is so important in really helping to provide an increase in worker safety. So ultimately, again, being able to make sure that we drive not only from a footwear perspective, but also a work environment perspective, as safe and as an effective use of that space as possible from an ergonomical perspective is incredibly important. When we see, especially now transitioning that conversation here to the aging workforce, we know that there is inherent increased risk across a wide spectrum of different areas. We're going to highlight 6. Certainly it's not comprehensive in terms of the list, but there's some big hitters here in terms of what we automatically are thinking about as this workforce continues to age over the next decade or so. The likelihood of all 6 of these different elements increasing significantly is going to really play a factor in the way that work-related injuries are accounted for. And obviously, we need these workers to stay in the workforce. They're still providing unbelievably valuable work and giving them the best chance of success to continue working and staying working and transferring that knowledge that we are really in so desperate need, especially in the trades currently with the status of the American workforce, is unbelievably important. So you have kind of starting off in the beginning, strains and sprains. Those are obviously typically going to be more acute-based injuries. So when you think about the variety of different opportunities that we just talked about in terms of making sure that individual environments are catered to individual workers, having adjustable and adaptable workstations that have ergonomic factors built into them is incredibly important. But we also see, as the body ages, overall changes in the way that tissues operate. So we lose some of the elastic nature of our soft tissue as we age. And as those tissues become stiffer, what happens is they're easier to become stressed. The relative stress that they can handle oftentimes decreases. So that total capacity to handle stress goes down because we lose some of that elasticity. And as a result, we are at greater risk of those sprains and strains just overall. The same then goes for fractures and breaks, making sure that as we have this older aging workforce, as they lose bone density with increasing age and oftentimes have a reduction in muscular strength, those two things together are not a real good combination. What used to maybe have just been a fall that might result in something like a bruise and some discomfort for a couple of days suddenly can become a lot more serious. Steve was sharing before the call, even some friends of his recently doing kind of relatively normal activities. I gotta jump out of my vehicle and go run to do something, tear a hamstring. That's a problem, right? So losing that elasticity across a variety of different structures is just going to increase that risk. So making sure that we have ergonomic friendly workstations, being able to do everything that we can to reduce the potential stress becomes even more incredibly important. osteoarthritis in a couple of really specific joints. Obviously, there's tons of literature on upper extremity osteoarthritis, and particularly when you're needing to kind of execute a variety of different tasks for your job in that way. But specifically, when we think of the lower extremity, knee osteoarthritis is an unbelievably large contributing factor to limiting ambulation for people, at least comfortable ambulation. And then also osteoarthritis in that big toe joint. I mentioned earlier how important it is to have that function. And over time, if there is continued stress and strain functionally in that joint, oftentimes we get bony prominence that develops on that joint, and it loses the ability to dorsiflex to the degree that we need it to. As a result of that, again, walking, just generally being on our feet becomes significantly more uncomfortable for those people that experience that. And so all of these are contributing factors that can significantly play a role in either direct injuries that become work-related over time because they're aggravated by the work environment the employee's placed in, or because of the discomfort that they're feeling, they may become distracted, which may make them less safe, or they may be shifting and moving away from that pain and discomfort, transferring that stress onto other structures, either proximally or distally, that then contributes to an unexpected injury in that way as well. When we look at peripheral neuropathy, we know that there is certainly a pandemic level problem with diabetes and pre-diabetic people being both pre-diabetic and diabetic in this country. Again, as the workforce continues to age, those relative percentages are not going to go down. And so whether that peripheral neuropathy is driven by something like diabetes, or they have neuropathic issues from another root cause, ultimately, when you start to lose that sensation, particularly in the feet, I mentioned earlier how important from a proprioceptive standpoint that is in terms of the feedback that your body depends on to maintain spatial location and balance. When you reduce some of those signals, it becomes incredibly difficult to walk, stand, and move, and really just control your body posture effectively. Plantar heel pain, so whether that is plantar fasciitis, plantar fasciopathy, any of these types of elements, most commonly it's going to involve the plantar fascia. Inflammation does not have to be present to experience plantar heel pain. So even though the blanket term that people get thrown around is always plantar fasciitis, plantar fasciosis, and a variety of different expressions of that pain and discomfort can have still that pain without the presence of inflammation. And so ultimately, the result is the same. We need to reduce both tensile forces, so that tension and traction across the plantar fascia, as well as reducing those compressive forces. So people that are at risk, again, standing for their job over long periods of time on a hard, flat surface, particularly as their age, the plantar fascia tends to get stiffer, as well as if you have had prolonged stress to the plantar fascia, the plantar fascia also tends to get larger and stiffer as a result of that as well, which then becomes, again, a self-fulfilling prophecy over time. And finally, we'll highlight Achilles tendonitis. I mentioned earlier, just in that graphic, when we were talking about standing, that increased stress on the Achilles, both standing and walking in a relatively harsh environment of something that's just hard and flat, especially with individual footwear that tends to be less accommodating in a variety of work scenarios, just increases the likelihood of being able to do something like irritate that Achilles, particularly then if you imagine a scenario in which somebody is already in that aging workforce, they're already getting an increased stiffness in that tendon itself, and then maybe they have to react quickly to move or to jump out of the way of something, as Steve mentioned, to jump out of a car and grab something real fast. You make a swift movement expecting everything to go normally as it has the previous years in your life. And then all of a sudden you've applied more stress and strain to that tendon than it's able to take. And we either have a tear or potentially a rupture, which then contributes to a significant amount of recovery time and surgical intervention. And so finally, I'll throw it to the panel and just say, hey, when we think about the most frequent lower extremity injuries that you see, what are those? What are the things that you see most frequently in your roles? And how does that potentially change based on the age of the employer patients that you work with?
Yes, definitely. We will hand it over to our panelists who have a ton of experience probably with this.
I can jump in first. I would say primarily with my clientele, it's the plantar foot pain seems to dominate most of my work related lower extremity issues. And with most of them, it comes with a change in job or change in demands on the job. And sometimes it'll also come with, change in outside activities unrelated to the workplace. But generally, almost always there's some sort of increased demand that the body isn't able to handle, kind of like you were talking earlier.
And we've certainly seen it with our partners, as well as some of the patients that I work with as well. As people have gone from only in the office to only at home to then transitioning either back into the office or potentially a hybrid or still only being at home, they're like not used to the stresses of either, well, maybe I'm going to walk around at my house all day barefoot, or maybe now I'm going to try to do a standing desk for the first time where I'm not even used to that. And those intermittent stresses where you're not increasing the capacity of any of the structures involved prior to making that significant change, even though it doesn't seem significant at the time, can really contribute to an increased stress and load on a variety of different tissues. And just like you said, I mean, plantar heel pain is all over the place with the way that people interact, and either at work or at home. And it can be, a prolonged battle for a lot of people, because especially if they're working on their feet, it's really hard to create that recovery window for a lot of people where you give them enough time for their body to recover from the stress and strain that it's experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I've seen injuries from agriculture with equine or bovine, like stepping on the caretaker's feet and crushing them that way. Had things with like a forklift running over people's feet. Those types of acute instances. So that's been my experience with some of these acute issues.
Yeah, there's not a lot that you can do to prepare yourself to be stepped on by a cow, right? I mean, that's not a there's no training for that. You can't build that up. So if you're not wearing a safety toe and a Met guard, you're in trouble. So that's a nice Liz Frank fracture or something else to deal with there. So definitely a stressful scenario for sure. And so I guess my first question now will be to Rey and Steve. Obviously, we're a little bit past our time. I want to make sure that we're being respectful of people's time and attendance. And so I have a case study that I can go through, or we can kind of wrap it here and have any additional questions and conversation. So you just let me know what makes the most sense.
Well, I would like to hear, if you don't mind, I'm
Sure.
to go on. The couple of things is the other thing too, Matt, is I've had 2 requests that said, can he come and do this for our organization? So I'm going to push that off to you all. I don't know, how you want to do that, but we're going to have this. We're going to make this available on our YouTube channel. But yeah, I would appreciate it. The other thing I want to say too, and the reason we've got the mix of folks or mix of experts is one of the things that we're tasked to do is get the message out. So we need to take a look. And oddly enough, this really technically should fall under industrial hygiene. This is not this is an industrial hygiene issue because it's typically a disease or a health issue. And so we have Albert Moore on here, who is not only a researcher but an industrial hygienist, and I'm interested in a follow-up conversation of how do we get this message out, because this is eye-opening. And I'm used to working in this area, but what this makes so much sense. And we're looking at the floodgates, so that's probably a lot more than a yes, let's continue. But those are things that are rolling around my head, as now we know, and how do we get that out there? So proceed.
All right. Well, we'll roll through this, and like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions at the end as well. And so ultimately what I wanted to look at, and this kind of just really dovetails with a lot of the things that we've talked about throughout the course of this presentation. And so the first thing that I'll highlight for people is, let's look at, regardless of the intervention, and certainly the intervention was with our products. That's not the point of talking about this per se. What we want to look at is where people started. What is the consistent experience that people were having? So again, on an average scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, or really 0 to 10, 0 being absolutely no pain or discomfort, 10 being the most severe and terrible that you can imagine. Anything above 4 is typically considered clinically significant. So when we start to put that into perspective, this is where this conversation around the residual discomfort that people are feeling becomes a very interesting and a very complex conversation. And so when we look at where we started in this case study, this is a manufacturing plant where they make very large potential scissor lifts. So very heavy machinery. There's kind of a variety of different work environments for people depending where they are in the assembly line. But ultimately, when you look at 97% of the people that were surveyed, had at least a 1 out of 10 or higher. So 97% of the people had at least some recognition of the fact that their feet were uncomfortable at some point during the course of a given work week. 95% reported having some amount of back pain, again, at least a 1. 76% of employees had significant pain, so in their feet, and 70% in their back. The primary source of that back pain, again, it was low back. And so ultimately, overall, 70% total reported that their overall body pain and discomfort was significant. So on a 4, on average, across the entirety of just the way that they feel at the end of the day, a 4 or higher. And so these become super complicated things, because ultimately the overwhelming majority of these people were not being actively treated in a work environment for any of these things. So these are just consistent complications that each of these workers are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And so when we talk about the potential of an intervention to create either space for recovery or prevention of worsening, or in some cases, complete resolution of that pain and discomfort, that's where the influence of the work that Steve and team are doing with ergonomic workspaces and being able to optimize, not in general, but for the person. Where we started at the very beginning of this talk was everybody's incredibly unique and complex. Like, their individual biomechanics are complex. Even if they're being asked to do the same thing as the people next to them, doesn't mean that the stress that they're experiencing is the same level of the people next to them. And so having an ergonomic work environment is unbelievably important, but also the ability to further that intervention in a way. So what we did with the insoles is we had a variety of different insoles that people could choose from. We had 4 different insoles. Basically what it was is a little bit more structured, a little bit less structured, a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner. So 2 on each side that really helped people to optimize based on their individual footwear, because again, these workers had a wide variety of responsibilities. So we were also dealing with a really wide variety of footwear, everything from a very traditional work boot, safety toe, exactly what you would expect, all the way to completely non-safety toe, kind of middle of the road sneaker, and then kind of everything in between. And so ultimately, with any intervention, it is not uncommon for the result of that intervention to have a short-term transient effect. So, hey, we provided this thing, and for a couple of weeks or maybe even a couple of days, it felt better, but now I'm kind of right back where I was. And so what we wanted to do is a little bit longer term look at what we were seeing, not after that first couple of days, the first couple of weeks, but a full month passed where any acclimation period or just residual adjustment to the intervention was going to be accounted for, and really seeing what the experience of those employees were. And so ultimately, 100% of the people that completed the survey the second time had some amount of reduction in pain. So whether that was foot pain, back pain, and or knee pain, all the way across, everybody experienced a reduction in that discomfort overall. And for both the foot pain and the back pain that were over that average of 4 initially, the average rating dropped below clinical significance. So it dropped into the 1 point something on both of those factors. And while that seems maybe insignificant, I promise you it's not. When we take something that was, again, from a clinically significant standpoint, saying, hey, this is worth treating to be able to reduce this, to now take it below that clinical recognition is something that I think is incredibly important. And so ultimately, 75% of employees experience an overall reduction in their body pain and discomfort, which again, they're going home feeling better at the end of the day. And that's something that is incredibly important, and ultimately what we're all trying to achieve and why we're here. And so when we take a step back, and it's not just about our product, when we're thinking about how do you make, for example, a recommendation or identify something like an insole intervention, I wanted to have a couple of take homes for people that aren't just specific to us and what we do, but could be more broadly applicable to a variety of situations, because ultimately putting shape underneath people's feet, it's literally the mission of our company, because we so strongly believe in the value of putting shape, 3-dimensional shape underneath a 3-dimensional foot is so incredibly impactful for helping that foot interact with footwear and the stressful environment that it's standing on. And so ultimately you want to look for reputable brands. Right now, if you were to just go on Amazon and do a search for insoles, there's going to be so many brands that never existed prior to the boom of Amazon Marketplace. And you don't know anything about them. You don't know what quality of product you might receive. And so ultimately, it's going to be very obvious if you look at, even if you're just shopping in a marketplace environment, brands that have aggregated not only significant amounts of ratings, but significant amounts of 4- and 5-star ratings are always where you want to focus and make your recommendations to. We want to make sure that any insole or a series of insoles that you might have and recommend have the ability to fit into a wide variety of footwear. Even in the workspaces that we deal with our partners, again, there's a huge amount of variation. Shoes that don't have removable insoles, shoes that do have removable insoles, shoes that are extremely firm in difficult, stressful environments because they need to be extremely protective. Shoes that have absolutely no, or workers that have absolutely no footwear requirement at all. You know, you look at the 2 shoes in this picture, an average like $75 Nike sneaker on one side and a pair of Vans on the other. That Vans, I can probably guarantee you, doesn't have a removable insole in it. So it becomes super challenging. How do you get something into that shoe? It needs to be thin and be able to maintain its structure so that that person can get that benefit. We want to make sure that the materials are durable. I mentioned earlier off the top, hey, these people, their body is a tool and they need their body to fit and function the way that they need it to into the activities expected of them for their jobs. And so ultimately we need materials that are going to be durable and be able to stand up to not only a day or a week or a month, but months of wear, long hours, stressful scenarios. And in order to do that, oftentimes you need a wider spectrum of products, because I mentioned earlier, people are going to interpret that very differently. A lot of the research that we've focused on internally at Superfeet over the last 6 to 7 years in a partnership with the University of Calgary has really been trying to understand, why do I find this specific insole, as an example, more comfortable, but Steve hates this insole but really likes this other one, and Ray really likes this one and hates this one. Why is that? And one of the big factors that we found is actually plantar sensitivity. And so looking at both sensitivity, tactile sensitivity, so sensitivity to touch, as well as sensitivity to vibration, plays a huge role in the way that people interpret the shape that you put underneath their foot. And so having both insoles that are a little bit more flexible, insoles that are a little bit firmer and structured, gives you the best chance of providing a successful intervention for a given workforce. And then finally, we really feel strongly around, in order to have success, especially in this type of stressful environment, we need a heel cup in that insole. Not all insoles have a heel cup, and we need that insole to probably be structured in order to maintain the function of it. And then it needs some amount of arch support and contour, because ultimately one of the prime characteristics that we want is to be able to increase surface area. If we increase surface area and contact area underneath the foot, there's two primary things that happen. Instantaneously, when we do that, we increase postural control. So balance is improved. Part of that is that increased proprioceptive feedback. You have more of your foot, more of those mechanoreceptors in contact and providing instantaneous feedback. The other is an instantaneous reduction of any single spot on the plantar surface of the foot is now experiencing a lower amount of pressure or force than it was before. So when we can take the same amount of load, distribute it over a larger surface area, we reduce the impact of that force or load at any given point of that surface area. And so that becomes incredibly important, especially over the course of a day where we know fatigue is going to be a significant factor of both kind of the micro and the macro, dealing with just the pain, injury, discomfort that might occur over time, as well as just in the space of a given day. And so again, I'll wrap it here and just say, one, thank you for everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. If the panel has any thoughts on, from the experience that they have, what are those solutions and strategies that you found most effective for working across this kind of variety, whether it's acute injury, overuse, or just the background factors that are contributing to people being uncomfortable? If you have any wisdom that you can share with the people watching here, I know that they would really appreciate it. And I would always love to learn about the success that other people are having, helping workers ultimately stay healthier, happier, and more comfortable and confident on their feet.
Yes, definitely. We'll open it up to the panelists.
I think one significant contributing factor is that the company would actually provide funding so people could have choices for their footwear, so that they have it subsidized or even maybe fully paid for, so they can go out and actually test and acquire things that fit their feet instead of just having to take whatever happened to be maybe in the company store.
Yeah, I think that's a great point for sure. I think ultimately the ideal scenario is always that one, that there's a voucher, if footwear is required, that there's some amount of voucher in place to help subsidize that. And the ideal scenario for the employee is that there's a retailer in place that can help fit them personally for that process. I think the amount of success that we see when an employee is able to be fit, whether it's size-wise, shape, the last of the overall shoe, being able to match that to the foot, being able to pair that with even things like socks that can help augment the fit or reduce moisture management issues, because obviously a lot of these work environments, they're generating sweat, they're moving around, and if they're wearing socks that can help manage that moisture, that can contribute to a variety of different issues, not the least of which is that the skin's going to be softer and more prone to things like calluses and blisters, which can contribute to a variety of different complications in and of itself. So I always advise, anytime an employee can find a trusted retail partner that can help really dial in that fit and personalize their experience with their footwear, it just makes a huge difference for sure.
Yeah, Matt, my background, being in the clinic as a physical therapist is basically returning all the patients back to that original kind of homeostasis, like you mentioned in the beginning, where it's that perfect blend of enough mobility, but then also the strength to control that mobility. And using exercise and maybe joint mobilizations to do so. But very frequently, I'm using some sort of orthosis to kind of offload those stresses, like you kind of alluded to. I think a couple times you mentioned it. Even if it's just a temporary, way to offload stress. If we can buy a patient 6 weeks, that's that's a game
Huge.
changer.
Yeah,
Game changer for
absolutely.
them to build up the strength or improve that mobility and get that capacity back so they have more wiggle room, depending on what's the task at hand.
Well, and I think you make a great point there, and certainly I would imagine. Well, I should probably say it the other way. I'm sure you've never had any issues with any patients being non-compliant. I'm sure that's not anything that you ever have to deal with, right? They
No.
all do their at-home exercises just like you tell them to, whether it's for strengthening, stretching, or everything in between. All of those things happen seamlessly. But for everybody else, I know that's not an issue for you, but for everybody else, one of the nice things about interventions, you mentioned something like an insole or a custom foot orthosis, as well as if there is the opportunity to improve or personalize footwear selection, is compliance is a lot higher with those interventions than it is with other types of interventions. And so when that is appropriate, it does give us a great opportunity to create a window to reduce that overall stress in a way that it's just harder to get compliance with, particularly when you get to talking about that older population potentially. So when it's going to be harder for them to increase that capacity of their tissues just because of the natural course of aging, sometimes it becomes necessary to have an extrinsic intervention in a way that might be more thorough or intensive than it would have been 10 years previous or 5 years previous for them, just because of the change in the way that their body responds to that stress and load, and because they've aggregated then an additional 5 years of stress from the work that they were doing to begin with. And so I think all of those things together, anytime that we can find ways to create that window, right? Because oftentimes, especially for lower extremity things, if it's not directly related to their work or impeding their work, either in their mind or in the minds of the employer, it's a lot harder to get a modification at work to execute things when it's not going to be driven by that, doctor's note or through the workers' compensation system. So anything that we can do to create that window for recovery just becomes so incredibly important.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to mention as well, because when you're dealing with feet, it's totally different than hands, because especially as we age, we have reduced blood flow anyways, and so you're already talking about a structure that's kind of got the deck stacked against them already with constantly being on your feet anytime. So any way that we can get help reducing that load, reducing that strain, we need to take advantage of with feet, whereas we might not have the same issue with some other joint.
Absolutely.
Matt, I had one question for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You had mentioned the need and the importance of comfort. In my practice, a lot of it is with runners, and in the running community, they talk about first feel a lot. So when you're talking about comfort, is that like the first time you slip them on, like that kind of feel? Is that where you're measuring that? Is that how they
So there's
or?
kind of there's different ways to do it. Ultimately, I think as a starting place, you're talking about that step-in comfort association. For the majority of people, the literature I think is pretty clear that 20 to 30 seconds, they can assess if they like it in that initial step-in feel relatively well. The important thing again is relative to application of use case, right? So the easy example is, you said runners. Hey, if you're buying a shoe to run in, let's make sure that we run in it to see how it feels to you. If you're buying it to walk or stand in, let's not run in it to evaluate it. Let's stand around for a little bit and see how it feels as we do that. But I think ultimately there is a fair amount of literature also on looking at that intermediate range. So after you've had it for a month or something like that, and what that looks like. And certainly there is a little bit of disparity in terms of those overall ratings. But generally speaking, what we really want to, because the majority of people have, let's say, a wider envelope of things that will work for them in terms of, it might be the difference between this shoe and this shoe and this shoe. And really all three of them are probably not different enough to elicit a negative reaction. But if there is that one that initially they go, I do not like this, it's not a positive response, we always want to make sure that we really pay attention to that. That tends to be a better single indicator of both short-term, intermediate, and potentially even long-term comfort ratings. It tends to be more consistent. It tends to be stronger in terms of how they do that. And over time, it decreases variability. So the kinematic variability that somebody expresses when they're moving, the more narrow that envelope of variability is, the more stressed certain structures become over time. It's just the same application of stress on a more reduced variable movement pattern. We want to increase kinematic variability. Running, as an example, or walking in a less comfortable footwear solution reduces kinematic variability. We don't want to do that, right? So we want to be able to kind of maximize that as much as we can. And so that would be another one of those reasons why, if people give us that indication, either as clinicians, as retailers, as safety professionals, whoever it might be, that this doesn't feel right, I don't like it, we really want to make sure that we pay attention to that more so than, I think I like this one a little bit more than this one. In all likelihood, both of them will probably work. I can talk about running stuff for hours, so probably dangerous to ask me too many more running questions.
Yeah, it's tempting, trust me.
Matt, I wanted to mention we have I actually know this person. He's a professional in the construction industry, Noble King. His question is, do feet injuries manifest pain elsewhere, one, and does this make it harder to properly diagnose a real issue? So we got three clinicians on here, and I think it's a great question.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm certainly happy to let the clinicians speak first if they'd like to. I'm happy to give an opinion, but I'm not in a clinic every day. So.
Oh, I'd like to kind of jump in and just say that, you did a great job with summary of the anatomy and the function. I think tonight you kind of opened up the focus on, what is the ID and the root cause of many pathological conditions. We treat back pain or hip pain, but oftentimes it's going to be gait, or it's going to be what's going on with the foot. And we don't think about that because ultimately it impacts the core, it impacts the concentration of the worker. And nobody really, tracks. We track lost days, time. We don't really track, what is the quality production that's occurring. And so foot function or leg function in general, lower extremity function, is all subconscious. When it becomes conscious, it actually interrupts our ability to produce quality products on an assembly line. And so we don't think about that or look at that. At least I've not seen any studies that do that. And so I think you've really done a good job tonight of kind of opening up a new topic, or not a new topic, but make us think harder about what happens when people have uncomfortable, they have uncomfort in their foot or in their ankle or whatever, because it impacts the entire body. When you reach for something, when you reach forward for something, the first muscles that fire are the muscles that control your legs and control your foot, to give you a center of balance, to give you, to ground you in what you're doing. And so, and there's not been a lot of good research done on, how this impacts total quality of life, but more importantly, production in the workforce. So I think it's an interesting topic, and it's something that we just need to look harder at as we look at solutions for the workplace. So I do believe it's a big part of problems that exist and other problems. You look at foot problems, but I think it also impacts the knee, the hip, the back. So I think that it's going to contribute to these other problems, and we're not looking at that. I don't know if we're actually asking those questions or not when we talk to patients, but I'm curious of asking, what is your company? I know your company has done some research. How big are your research projects on production and errors and concentration and focus and how, when they get your product or a product like yours, how it impacts their ability to be able to conduct quality work versus that type of.
We haven't looked at it specifically from that perspective, and there's definitely nothing that I've been able to find in the literature specifically addressing that. I think the one of the studies that I mentioned earlier, they put a label on it as presenteeism. So you're present, but you're less efficient because you're in pain. And that was relative to catastrophic injury, or really significant injury. But I think it's just as true for less intensive injury. And I think the problem is, because I mentioned earlier, it gets normalized. So you'll see people modify the way that they go about their day because they're expecting to be in pain at the end of the day.
Mhm.
So they'll either change the way that they plan work to be done, or you'll see them start to make modifications in the way that they're standing, the way that they're moving, trying to avoid things. And so if it's already uncomfortable to take a few steps, you might be more willing to lean forward in a way that's sacrificing posture of the position of backs, shoulders, other things. You're not even trying to do it. It's just something you're like, that's going to suck. I'm not going to do that. Right. So I think there's a lot of layers to it. And I think part of the problem, when you think of, hey, even in our summary, even in our survey projects, a lot of times what gets a little bit muddled is things like, hey, do you feel like you have more balance? And a lot of times people would say, no, I feel the same. I don't feel this significant difference. But almost every study that we've ever done, when we've looked at either us or just unsponsored research that uses our products, immediate improvements in postural control. So even if they don't feel it, it's there. And so it's this tangible versus intangible benefit for a lot of people, which is very interesting. So even if they don't perceive that they're more stable, oftentimes they're functioning in a more stable way. You can also see that manifest in general body posture. A lot of times, for example, with restricted first Rey or first MPJ flexibility, you'll see people start to rotate forward. So they'll have a more anteriorly rotated body posture, both in the thoracic spine as well as a head forward position. And then when you do that, it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because now you're stressing it more and you're leaning more and your center of mass is further forward. And so as a result of that, they can't propel themselves nearly as much typically. And you don't get an apropulsive gait, but you typically get a complication there. And sometimes that is a more inverted foot posture during toe off. So they're avoiding that big toe because it doesn't flex. And that's more stressful to more proximal structures like the plantar fascia. Or in other scenarios, they may have a reduced range of motion in that whole posterior chain. Their heel lifts early, and then they're really leaning further forward, putting more stress on their low back. So again, it can be that self-fulfilling prophecy over time where there's not a singular thing where you go, man, if we just fix X, everything's going to be fine. It's that accumulation, and then it may be 2 to 3 different compensations over time that then lead to an issue that then gets treated, but we're only treating the issue that the pain is dealing with directly. And so, the original question is, hey, does the foot contribute to pain in other places? I would say both directly and indirectly. Certainly it'd be less frequent to have pure referred pain, right? That is not nearly as common unless it's a relatively close by association, right? If there's residual swelling or if there's some sort of nerve entrapment or damage, you might have some residual pain, but typically that referred pain is not going to be caused directly from the foot. However, whether it's posture related, whether it's the transfer of forces throughout the lower extremity, or even something that is very much a pet topic of interest for me is vibration and the contributing nature of vibration to fatigue. So when you're walking, it just so happens that the resonant frequency that's generated from the colliding of your foot with the ground overlaps almost perfectly with the resonant frequency of soft tissue to vibrate. And so there's a lot of vibration translation and transfer through the lower extremity up into the mid portion of your body. Ultimately, your goal is to damp that vibration evolutionarily so that it doesn't reach the base of your skull. Because if it reaches the base of your skull, it interferes with your field of vision. And obviously, as a primary point of proprioception and decision making for the overwhelming majority of people, when you start interfering with your vision and you can't tell the difference between, well, is that a snake or is that a stick? Is that the edge of the road or is that the edge of a cliff? That decreases the likelihood of successfully completing your life cycle, right? So we want to really damp that vibration, but there's all sorts of problems with that, right? When we have that counter contraction of muscles that helps to create that damping effect on vibration translation, it also increases fatigue. So those muscles are contracting, trying to damp the vibration. You then have to deal with the fact that those muscles may then fatigue more quickly or earlier in the course of an activity. And then you have things like adipose tissue, which basically do absolutely nothing. So fat cannot damp any vibration at all. And so the more fat mass you have, not only the overall mass that you have and the more vibration you're going to generate, but then you have less tissue that helps reduce that vibration and damp it overall. So again, becomes a partially self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh yeah.
And footwear does a terrible job of damping vibration as well, right? Because cushioning properties in general tend to be significantly lower. The footwear tends to be significantly heavier. So it's already costing you more to move anyway. So all of those things in general contribute to a little bit more harsh environment for your body.
Yeah, oddly enough, Matt, you don't know this, and there was nothing pre-planned, but our next mission control, which is scheduled for October, I think 21st, we've got a gentleman by the name of Dr. Keith White, who is going to be presenting on vibrometry.
Nice.
Seriously. Yeah, it's hand-arm vibration, whole body vibration. And that's what he did his dissertation on in Texas A&M was vibrometry. So this is a huge issue. It's something that people with extended or extensive training in ergonomics, they get around to in their programming, but just we're removing barriers and we want to give people training. And it's odd that you brought that up, that you so I'm gonna be contacting you after this, see if I can get you to be a panelist. It definitely is an issue. The other thing is, as you know, Ergonauts is a lean systems based organization. So we're developing it's called Lower Extremity Management System, and I can assure you Superfeet are going to be part of that. And it's getting the message out to the employers, this is what you look for overall and how you manage that. And the sad thing about this whole thing, or there's multiple sad things, but a pair of Superfeet costs less than 2 pizzas. And so, I can have something under my foot, which is lining my body, and I'm testimonial any day. But people don't, they'll spend $1,500 on a phone, but when you look at, it's lack of education and it's lack of having things readily available. So that's one of the things, from employment perspective we want to do, because I'm telling you, I work in heavy construction. We are so far from, we have 690,000 open jobs, and the boomers are going out every day. So it's a crisis. I mean, it's a time-space continuum, and we're going to continue to work on it, but it's got to be done systematically, or it's kind of like throwing spaghetti in against the wall, seeing what sticks. So
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're going to be working on. And, we look forward to working with you folks in the future. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Matt. That was awesome, and thanks to all the panelists who joined us and all the questions that were asked. We have just a few more words from Steve, and then should be good.
Yeah, I just want to tell you, these are not, when I use the term sponsor loosely, these are favorite products. Superfeet's always there. That is an absolute favorite product. Lily Pad, they make a great desk. It's a cool story about a father and son who put it together. It's all American made products. We have our Atomic Ergo, which we've interviewed some of the brightest minds on the planet, and we've got more lined up. So that's something that we really want to focus on is getting the message out. There's a product called Mousetrapper. It's European. It's a great little it's kind of a mouse keyboard combination, but it's great. We've got a partner in California, iHealth 360. And then there's a chair that we love. It comes in 3 pieces. 80% of the US population can't assemble one. It comes in the box. You open the top of the box and it's 3 pieces. You can literally have it assembled in 2 minutes. And it's a great product. Then Commonwealth Hand and Physical Therapy. That's actually Dr. Pitts's company. He has multiple clinics scattered across Kentucky. Again, he's one of the, if probably the top hand therapist or upper extremity therapist on the planet. So, but I can't tell you, express enough gratitude. This is the thing we didn't get to, and I see it on a daily basis on such a scale that's crazy. But one of the things that we want to, I think we should probably plan something again. Matt did an analysis on the boots that our U.S. military wears, standard issue, and there's a whole bunch of opportunities for the people that are putting their life on the line to, with just a little enhancement, we could make their lives so much easier. And again, I work on a lot of bases, and I see a lot of people that are miserable with foot pain. So that's all I have. But again, on behalf of Ergonauts, we are so grateful to everybody that's looking back at the camera at me here. So.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
and I'll just say thanks again for having me. It was a great opportunity. I really appreciate all the great comments and contributions from the panelists, and yeah, just glad to be here. Ultimately, we just want to help more workers, right? Help more people, keep people healthy and happy, and being able to do the work that's meaningful to them and meaningful to our country. So.
Yep, and you can reach Matt through. He's got a LinkedIn account. I'm sure there's other ways we'll be posting this, and there's other ways to contact him. But again, they don't need a middle person, or our relationship with them is we love their product and they prevent suffering. So we'll get around to that. But again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and stay tuned. We're going to be posting this on the YouTube channel, and hopefully reach out hundreds of people,
Yeah.
not thousands. Thank you.